As we wait to see what happens next with the coronavirus, a Canadian doctor has a front row seat. Dr. Bruce Aylward is Assistant Director General with the World Health Organization. He and a team just spent 2 weeks in China studying how that country suppressed the COVID-19 outbreak, restricting it largely to the city of Wuhan and the surrounding province. It is now spreading faster outside China than inside that country. Dr. Aylward, thanks so much for joining us. This is such a fast-evolving situation. The numbers change by the hour. You're among a handful of people watching this more closely than anyone else in the world. What's your assessment of where we're at with this virus?
Well, we're at a pretty critical point right now because we're at a point where we're seeing a rapid international spread, as one would anticipate with a virus like this. We're seeing evidence that this can actually be contained and controlled, but we're not seeing that effort to contain and control it keep pace with the spread. So we're right at a tipping point where the commitment of governments and countries to really get on top of this is going to be crucial in the coming few days and weeks.
What is the most critical thing right now?
The most critical thing here, Donna, is speed. This is a virus which, to the surprise of a lot of us, it's a respiratory virus, so it spreads similar to the way of flu, but there are differences. And that provides us a little window to, if we move very fast in a country, to be able to find it quickly, contain the cases or isolate them, find their close contacts, and stop what we call transmission chains. And that can prevent an awful lot of damage to the health of people in a country and to the economies, as we've seen in some of the countries affected.
Doctor, this virus is new to humans. What do you think is the most important thing we still don't know about it?
Well, the key thing, the first and most important thing is to educate the population. People have to know what COVID is. It's not a cold, it's not a runny nose, it's a high fever and a dry cough. And people with those symptoms have got to be able to get tested and tested quickly. You don't want to test everybody with a cold. You're going to burn through your reagents and test kits and you're going to flood your system. You really want to focus it on those key symptoms. Test them quickly and then know whether or not they have to be isolated. Find out who their close contacts are, because 5 to 10% of those are going to get the disease as well. And that's where the virus is. That's what you have to focus on.
What do we know specifically about the transmission of this virus?
There's some really important things we know, Donna. The most important is that the vast majority of the transmission is going to be driven by people who have the symptoms, as well as their very close contacts. And most of it is going to be occurring in areas where you've got prolonged exposures in close proximity, in families, in a cubicle, maybe at work. We saw it in mental health institutions. We've seen it in old age homes, in environments like that. We've seen it in some conferences where people are packed in rooms for long periods. So we're getting a better sense of what the big drivers are. And we're also learning what they aren't, which is just as important. I keep hearing this tip of the iceberg story, as if there's all these people with asymptomatic disease wandering around that could be transmitting it. There's no evidence of that. Sure, there are some asymptomatic people, but there aren't what we call asymptomatic transmission chains. Eventually, someone's going to show the disease, not eventually, very, very quickly. So that's the reason these measures actually can work.
So you're saying for certain now that people who are asymptomatic are not transmitting it?
A small proportion of people will be asymptomatic. Most of them will develop disease within 24 to 48 hours or a little bit longer. A couple may not, but it's a very, very small proportion. And that's important because that tells you that's not what's driving the transmission, because you got to find out what are the main drivers, because that's what you want to affect. And with everybody, worrying so much about asymptomatics, it's like, do something about the disease you can see, because that's going to slow this down and that's going to stop transmission. We also know, Donna, that some people can shed the virus for 24 hours or 48 hours before they get sick or they show the symptoms. And that's why when you look for your contacts, you look at not only who had contact with the person when they were sick, but also in the 24, 48 hours beforehand, because they could also have been exposed. And this is what China did. Every time it learned a little bit about the virus, it adapted its strategy to take advantage of that. And that's why they've turned it around.
Dr. Aylward, who is most vulnerable? We know the elderly and people with underlying health issues are dying from it. But we've heard of cases where younger people get it and die too. What did you learn about that in China?
Yeah, this was a really important question, and I emphasize it a lot when I'm speaking with folks. There's a lot of 30-year-olds, 40-year-olds, 50-year-olds who get this disease. They're very healthy and they die quickly sometimes. And so we spend a lot of time talking to physicians because often it's the observation of people treating these people that give you a hypothesis that then you can test and explore. And they don't know. That is one of the, and a journalist asked me the other day, what was one of the most concerning things that you didn't, figure out in China? That was the one. We could not find, hypotheses, little things that we could grab onto and say, okay, let's test that, let's explore that. They said that we don't know why these people are deteriorating. So it's a big, still unanswered question, and it's a really important one, because that would help us obviously tackle this. We could say, okay, we know who's at risk, so let's focus there. But right now we can't.
And this is a key question for parents. What about children getting it?
So children are another interesting piece of the puzzle. It's not as alarming as the one I just told you, because what it seems like in children, there's almost, I want to be very careful when I say no question here, because we've known this virus for 8 weeks, but it looks like children have in general, a more mild form of the disease. Now, they can, though, get sick and they can die, but at a much lower frequency. The other thing is it seems that children are also not getting infected as often as adults. Now, that could be an artifact of the fact that in many places they've closed schools. In many places they've reduced the risk of children getting infected. So I think we're still learning about that. One other interesting observation we found in China was there were very, very few cases in which we could point to a child had infected the parents or others. More often it was the other way around. So for multiple reasons, it just seems that they don't play the same role in driving transmission as they do in flu. As you know, in flu, the schools get sick, the kids get sick, and it goes from there.
What specifically do we know about the mortality rate? The WHO has said it appears to be 3.4%. Is it possible to know that with any certainty at this stage?
I think we know the range of mortality with this, and that is going to be somewhere between 1% and 4%, depending on the context. And the Director General of WHO went out with that number yesterday because what he was seeing and what really alarmed him, Donna, was that people were cherry picking the lowest number they could find in the lowest context they could find. And they were saying, oh, we're like that. And that's a really dangerous assumption because, for example, in China, what I was really impressed with was the sophistication of the system. They've gotten really good at keeping people alive who get this disease long enough to be able to get their lung functions back. But when you look at the rough numbers, it's still an alarming number. And look at places like Italy and others that have gotten recently infected. Some of them have high mortality rates that are over 1-2%. It may be a function of where they are in their outbreak, but that should be alarming.
Canada is ramping up preparations. What do you make of Canada's response?
It's impressive. Remember, here's a country that has found, if I remember correctly, you've had about 30 cases so far, 3 different provinces. They stretch back well over a month now, if I remember correctly as well, which means that you've got a heightened surveillance system. You've learned a lot of lessons from SARS. You also, you've been preparing for this for the last 15, 20 years since the SARS outbreak in Toronto. But even before that, since you put in place a universal health coverage system. So there aren't big barriers to people getting rapidly tested and rapidly treated. But clearly as well, after SARS, you built a public health care system that knows how to find cases, investigate them, follow their contacts, and manage them properly, because you're not seeing clusters of outbreaks around these cases. So far, it's impressive what Canada's achieved.
Do you think it's too much or inappropriate for countries to do worst case scenario planning?
You have to plan for worst case scenarios, and you plan for all case scenarios. So in this disease, you want to know, and you want to tell your population, here's what we're going to do if we have individual cases. Here's what we're going to do if we start having clusters. Here's what we're going to do if we have widespread community transmission, because you have to bring your population with you. They're the key. It is not the Public Health Agency of Canada that's going to stop COVID. It's going to be the population of Canada working as a surveillance system, washing their hands, rapidly detecting and notifying and working with the system. But that was the big thing in China. People ask me, what's the big message? They believe it's a societal duty to work together against common threats like this, and it's very, very impressive.
Dr. Aylward, do you see any light at the end of this tunnel?
I think right now, the light that we're looking for is governments really saying, this is serious. We have to act fast. We've got to eliminate barriers. And we're not seeing that. It's sluggish. Remember, these countries that are getting infected now have a month and a half to get ready for this, right? The Chinese provinces had 2 weeks. They moved fast. And what I saw in China, Donna, was when I left, I was talking to the governors and mayors as their cases were dropping. And so they had dropping cases, and they were buying ventilators, building new hospital beds because they wanted to be ready if this came back. And then I come back to Europe, and people are asking the question, do we need to buy ventilators? Do we need to build beds as their cases are going up? It's such a different mentality.
So your message to those countries is to get with it and get on with it.
Get ready, be fast.
Do you know if people who tested positive, then got better and tested negative for the virus, have become reinfected?
Yes, we've seen evidence of people test negative and then a day or a couple of days later, et cetera, test positive again. But that's not unusual in a viral process where sometimes they'll have a lot of virus shedding and sometimes they won't. What we have not seen, though, is evidence that people who recovered got sick again. We've not seen that so far, at least not to my knowledge.
Dr. Aylward from the World Health Organization, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to us.
My pleasure. Thank you very much, Donna.